The millionaire abandoned his wife just after she gave birth to black triplets, kicking her out of the house and leaving her with nothing. 10 years later, a shocking family secret is revealed. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The early morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the bedroom as Julia stirred beneath the covers. Beside her, Anthony was already awake, reading something on his phone, a habit she often teased him about. But today, she didn't mind. Today, she had news. Julia turned to face him, a warm smile on her lips as excitement bubbled inside her. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, and in that moment, everything else seemed to fall away. Anthony's face lit up with pure joy. He dropped his phone and scooped her into his arms, pulling her close as he peppered her face with kisses. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice catching in his throat. "I'm serious," she laughed, tears welling in her eyes. They had been trying for a year, and every negative test had been a disappointment. But not this time. This time, it was real. The next few months were blissful. They decorated a nursery, argued playfully over baby names, and spent lazy Sundays imagining what their future would look like as a family of 3. Julia reveled in the way Anthony touched her growing belly, how he would whisper secrets to the baby at night when he thought she was asleep. Their world felt whole. It was the dream they had always shared, and it was finally coming true. As her due date approached, Julia marveled at how smooth the pregnancy had been. She was healthy, the baby was healthy, and their lives were perfect. Or so she thought. The labor was sudden and intense, but Julia was ready. Or at least, as ready as any first-time mother could be. Anthony rushed to the hospital with her, holding her hand and offering words of comfort between contractions. They were in this together. They had always been in everything together. But then, in the chaos of the delivery room, everything shifted. The doctor's voice was calm but surprised. "It's not 1 baby, it's 3. Julia blinked through the pain, barely processing the words. "Triplets?" She hadn't expected that, but a surge of love and excitement filled her chest. 3 babies. 3 beautiful babies. Anthony was less composed. His face, once glowing with anticipation, paled as the first cries filled the room. The nurses rushed to clean and swaddle the infants, each one presented to the exhausted parents in turn. Julia could barely keep her eyes open as they placed the 3rd baby in her arms. But Anthony was staring. Not at the babies with wonder or joy, but with confusion. And then, with something darker. Julia followed his gaze, and her heart stopped. The baby's skin was darker than theirs. Much darker. She had no words, only a flood of fear and panic as she saw the storm brewing behind Anthony's eyes. The doctor's voice faded into the background as Anthony stood frozen, staring at the triplets in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he finally hissed, his voice sharp enough to slice through the air. Julia tried to speak, but her mouth went dry. "Anthony, don't." His voice was cold, colder than she'd ever heard. "Don't you dare." He took a step back from the bed, his eyes flickering between the 3 newborns and the woman he thought he knew. His body tensed, his jaw clenched. "They're not mine," he said, his voice thick with anger. Julia's chest tightened. "Of course they are, Anthony. Please, just. They're not mine." His voice was louder now, drawing the attention of a nurse who looked between them with concern. He turned on his heel, pacing the room as if he could escape the reality unfolding in front of him. "Who is it, Julia? Who did you sleep with?" Julia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind spinning. How could she answer a question she didn't understand herself? The babies were his. There was no one else. She hadn't even looked at another man, much less slept with one. "Anthony, listen to me." "No, you listen." He pointed a trembling finger at the 3 swaddled infants. Those babies aren't mine. Do you think I'm stupid? You've been cheating on me, haven't you? Julia gasped, shaking her head as tears welled in her eyes. I haven't. I swear, I haven't. I don't know why. I don't want to hear it, he snapped. His voice, once full of love, was now dripping with venom. Get out. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. What? You heard me. His eyes were wild with rage and disbelief. Take your kids and get out of my house. You want to betray me? Fine. But don't expect me to raise another man's children. Julia felt the ground give way beneath her. This was supposed to be the happiest moment of their lives, and instead, it was unraveling in front of her. Anthony, please, don't do this. Just give it time. We can figure this out together. There's nothing to figure out, he said, his voice ice cold. You lied to me. And now you're going to live with the consequences. Before Julia could say another word, Anthony turned and stormed out of the room, leaving her alone with the babies, her mind reeling. She tried to steady her breath, but nothing made sense. Her whole world had shattered in a matter of minutes. Hours later, after the hospital discharged her, Julia found herself standing on the front steps of their home, the triplets bundled in her arms, their soft breaths a reminder of the life she was now solely responsible for. The house she had once called home loomed large before her, cold and unwelcoming. Anthony had changed the locks. A hastily packed bag of her belongings sat on the front porch, a brutal reminder of how swiftly everything could fall apart. She stood there for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't even had time to process what had happened. How could everything she knew, everything she trusted, be gone in the blink of an eye? With nowhere to turn, Julia scooped up her bag, her babies nestled against her chest, and walked away from the life she thought she'd have forever. As she walked down the street, the weight of the unknown pressed heavily on her. She had no plan, no support, and no idea how she would survive this. But as the triplets squirmed in their blankets, cooing softly, Julia made a quiet promise to them, and to herself. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let this break her. She would find a way. For them. And for herself. Julia stood on the corner of a street she barely recognized. The once familiar world of quiet, manicured lawns and smiling neighbors had been replaced by something colder, rougher. She held her babies close, the weight of their small bodies both comforting and overwhelming as she surveyed the neighborhood. It wasn't where she wanted to be, but right now, it was the only place she could afford. Her savings had dried up faster than she imagined. Between hospital bills, the costs of caring for 3 newborns, and Anthony's swift decision to freeze their joint accounts, she was left with nothing. He hadn't even had the decency to discuss it. Just shut her out, emotionally and financially. As though she were the one who had broken their vows. Her heart clenched at the memory of his final words to her in the hospital, the venom in his voice. And worse, the silence afterward. He hadn't returned any of her calls or texts. Every attempt to explain, to plead for some understanding, had been met with icy indifference. He wanted her gone. And the world was eager to oblige. The apartment was a cramped 2-bedroom on the edge of the city. The walls were thin, the air heavy with the smell of fried food from the diner downstairs. It wasn't what she imagined when she thought of raising her children, but it would have to do. Julia had no choice. No job, no support, no husband. As she moved boxes into the apartment, she heard murmurs from neighbors, the low hum of gossip trailing behind her like a shadow. She'd heard it all before. People whispering behind their hands, casting judgment as if they knew the truth of her life. They didn't. But that didn't stop them from talking. It had started shortly after the birth. When Anthony told people why they split, his version of events spread like wildfire. Julia could only guess what he had said, but she could feel the stares, the sharp edge of assumptions cutting her down. She didn't just lose her husband, she lost her reputation, her standing. She was branded, not as a mother doing the best she could, but as a woman who had betrayed her husband in the worst possible way. Julia could still hear Mrs. Dunlap's voice echoing in her mind, the way she had clucked her tongue when Julia tried to explain. "I always thought you were better than that, Julia. Guess I was wrong." It didn't matter how many times Julia tried to deny the rumors or insist that Anthony was wrong. The truth didn't seem to count anymore. People saw what they wanted to see, and what they saw was a woman who had, in their eyes, sinned beyond forgiveness. Her sleep was thin and restless in those first few weeks, punctuated by the cries of her children and the hollow ache in her chest that only seemed to grow with each passing day. She kept replaying her life with Anthony over and over in her mind, trying to pinpoint where everything had gone wrong. There was a time when they were happy, when their life had felt like a warm cocoon. Flashbacks of laughter in their big kitchen, Anthony sneaking up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist, the two of them dancing in the glow of the soft kitchen lights. She'd always loved how he smiled at her, as if she were the only thing that mattered in his world. Those days felt impossibly far away now, like they belonged to someone else. But Julia could still feel them, lingering just beneath the surface, like an old wound that refused to heal. She remembered their last anniversary, just a few months before the pregnancy. Anthony had surprised her with a weekend trip to a cabin in the mountains. They spent the days hiking, talking about their future, the children they hoped to have, the life they wanted to build. They made love under the stars, wrapped in blankets, and the illusion that nothing could touch them. Now, that illusion was gone. Smashed to pieces by Anthony's rage, his inability to believe her. He had always been the pragmatic one, the man who needed everything to fit neatly into place. And when their children didn't fit the image he had in his mind, he had tossed her and their babies aside like they were strangers. The divorce papers came in a plain white envelope, handed to her by a weary postal worker who barely met her eyes. There was no letter, no explanation, just cold legal jargon and a list of demands. Anthony wanted full custody of everything, except the children. The house, the cars, the savings. He didn't care what happened to the babies, he only cared about erasing her from his life as completely as possible. Julia stared at the papers for hours, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of it all. He had moved on. Filed for divorce before they even had a real conversation about what had happened. He was done with her. Done with the family they had built. And she was left to pick up the pieces. Her lawyer, a woman with kind eyes but a sharp tongue, had been frank with her. "You have to be prepared for a war, Julia. He's claiming infidelity, and with the way the kids look and what you told me of the way he reacted, I bet he is going to extend the court battle for as long as he can. But the right thing to do is to demand a DNA test." The thing is, Julia didn't have any energy left in her. Even to hear the word war, she had felt the little remainder of energy she had leaving her body. Since she had had the babies, she had had no time to recover or rest. Her postpartum period, which for any woman was a challenging time, had become a nightmare when she found herself alone. Her husband left her with nothing, his family naturally had taken his side, all her friends had turned their backs on her. And she had no family of her own. Apart from her babies, that is, so as she sat in front of her lawyer, she had nodded numbly, knowing she would not pursue any rights right now. She simply could not. Anthony had the upper hand. He always had. And she was just trying to survive. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Julia found herself taking on any work she could get, cleaning houses, working nights at the local diner, anything to keep a roof over her head and food on the table for her children. Her hands were raw from scrubbing, her feet ached from standing, but she kept going. There was no other option. The few friends she thought she had vanished, one by one, as the rumors spread. People avoided her in the grocery store, whispered when she walked past. She'd become a pariah. Even her parents, who had never fully approved of her marriage to Anthony, seemed distant. When she called, the conversations were brief, awkward, filled with long silences. "I told you he wasn't right for you," her mother had said once, the words slipping out like a scold. But he was, Julia had whispered, more to herself than to her mother. He was. Every day was a battle. Between the exhaustion, the judgment, and the gnawing sense of loss that threatened to consume her, Julia fought to keep her head above water. There were moments when she wanted to give up, to scream at the unfairness of it all. But she couldn't. Not when there were 3 little lives depending on her. She wasn't the woman she used to be. She was something else now. Someone stronger, harder. And while the world might have turned its back on her, she would not turn her back on her children. No matter what it took, she would find a way to build a life for them. Even if it meant doing it alone. The years passed in a blur of sleepless nights, school lunches, scraped knees, and whispered prayers. Julia had learned to live with the weight of what had happened, though it never fully left her. Her triplets, now 6 years old, filled her days with the kind of joy that only motherhood could bring. They were bright, curious, and full of life, her reason to keep going. Their laughter echoed through the small apartment, transforming it from a place of hardship into something more like home. Yet, no matter how much time had passed, the question still lingered. How could this have happened? The mystery of her children's origins gnawed at her, even in the quiet moments when she thought she had pushed it far enough away to forget. There were no answers, just the relentless whispers of doubt that crept into her thoughts when she was least prepared for them. She had never told her children about the way their father had left them, how he had rejected them without so much as a backward glance. They were too young to understand, and Julia couldn't bear the thought of them carrying that hurt. Instead, she told them stories about how much she loved them, how proud she was to be their mother. It was enough for now. But she knew the questions would come one day, and when they did, she wasn't sure how she'd answer. It was a cold autumn afternoon when the letter arrived, unmarked and unfamiliar. Julia had been sorting through the mail absent-mindedly, tossing aside bills and flyers, when the envelope caught her eye. There was no return address, just her name scrawled in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. She sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. The message was short, but the weight of it pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. The truth about your children is closer than you think. Ask the right questions. Julia stared at the letter, her mind spinning. The words were cryptic, but they ignited something deep inside her, a spark of fear mixed with hope. Could this be the answer she had been waiting for all these years? Or was it just another cruel twist, meant to torment her when she had finally found some semblance of peace? For a long time, she sat there, the letter resting on the table in front of her. She had spent years trying to forget, trying to move on from the betrayal and the loss. She had built a life, small and imperfect as it was, around her children. Did she really want to open this door? Did she want to dig into the past when the future was all that mattered? In the end, Julia folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Across town, Anthony's life was unraveling, though from the outside, it appeared picture-perfect. He had remarried 3 years after the divorce, this time to Sarah, a woman who seemed, at first glance, to be everything he needed. Sarah was polished, poised, and meticulous in her approach to life. She had a way of making everything look effortless, from dinner parties to charity events, and she thrived on the appearance of perfection. At first, Anthony was drawn to her control. After the chaos of his first marriage, the questions and confusion that had followed him after the birth of the triplets, Sarah's structure was like a bomb. She kept their home immaculate, their schedules tight, their lives free of drama. But as the years went on, that control began to feel more like suffocation. Sarah had a way of making him feel small, though she did it with a smile. She never raised her voice, never argued, but her disappointment was sharp and constant. When he left a dish in the sink, she'd click her tongue and quietly clean it, as if his mistakes were something she simply had to bear. When he forgot a date night or missed a meeting, she'd sigh and say, "It's fine, Anthony. Really? I know you're trying." Her words were kind, but they cut deep. Nothing he did was ever quite good enough, and the pressure to live up to her expectations was beginning to wear on him. Anthony found himself retreating more and more into silence, into the bottle of bourbon he kept hidden in his office drawer. He wasn't proud of it, but it dulled the edge of her criticism, softened the sharpness of his failures. He thought often of Julia, though he would never admit it. He hadn't seen her or the children since the divorce. He didn't want to. He had convinced himself that it was easier this way, that walking away had been the right choice, the only choice. But in the quiet hours of the night, when Sarah's soft breathing filled the room, he wondered. He wondered if he had made a mistake. Julia tried to keep her focus on the present. Her children were thriving, each with their own unique personalities that never ceased to amaze her. Marcus, the eldest by 2 minutes, was headstrong and curious, always asking questions that Julia struggled to answer. Caleb was quieter, more introspective, content to lose himself in books and daydreams. And Lily, the youngest, was full of fire, her energy and enthusiasm lighting up every room she entered. They were her whole world, and she was determined to give them the life they deserved, even if it wasn't the one she had imagined. But there were moments, when Marcus would look at her with those big brown eyes, or when Lily would ask innocently about where their daddy was, when the weight of everything came crashing down again. Julia knew the day would come when they would demand answers, when she would have to explain what happened between her and Anthony, why he had left, why he had never come back. And when that day came, she would need to be ready. But for now, she focused on the simple joys of their lives. School projects, soccer games, bedtime stories. She had learned to find happiness in the little things, to treasure the moments of peace that came with being their mother. And so, the letter remained tucked away, a silent reminder that the past was never truly gone. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the day when Julia would be forced to confront it. But until then, she held her children close, hoping that love was enough to protect them from the truth she wasn't ready to face. Anthony stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the pristine lawn of their suburban home. Everything was in its place, the grass perfectly trimmed, the flower beds immaculately arranged. It looked like a page out of a lifestyle magazine. But inside, the house felt empty, cold. His hands gripped the edge of the countertop, the tension in his shoulders a constant reminder of how tightly he was wound. Sarah's voice drifted in from the living room, sharp and clipped as she argued with a contractor over some minor detail in the renovations. She was always in control, always managing something, whether it was the house, their social calendar, or his schedule. At first, he'd been grateful for it. After the mess with Julia, Sarah had been like a bomb, efficient, focused, everything running smoothly. But now, her control felt more like a vice, squeezing the life out of him. Infertility hung between them like a thick, unspeakable cloud. They'd been trying for 2 years, and with every failed test, Sarah became more tightly wound, more controlling. She masked her disappointment well. On the surface, everything was fine. She smiled at dinner parties, played the gracious hostess. But at home, when it was just the two of them, her frustration simmered just below the surface. She would sit silently, her lips pressed thin, eyes flickering with the weight of things unspoken. Anthony had suggested seeing a specialist, even brought up the idea of adoption, but Sarah dismissed it every time. She wanted their child, their biological child. And the more she pushed, the more Anthony began to feel like a failure, like somehow, this was his fault. He wasn't enough for her. He never had been. At work, things weren't much better. Anthony had always been driven, focused on his career as a way to keep his mind off the past. But lately, setbacks had piled up, one after another. A major deal he'd been working on for months had fallen through at the last minute, blindsiding him and his team. The pressure from his boss, always high, had become suffocating. Long hours at the office no longer resulted in success, but in more stress, more failure. He felt himself slipping, once confident, now filled with doubt. His decisions at work were second-guessed by colleagues, his boss had grown impatient, and the deadlines that used to feel manageable now loomed like threats. The success he'd built his life around seemed to be slipping through his fingers, just like everything else. Late at night, when he lay beside Sarah in bed, her back turned to him, Anthony's mind wandered. The silence in their bedroom was different from the silence he had shared with Julia. With Julia, there had been comfort, warmth, even in the quiet. But now, it felt like he was miles away from the life he had once known. He couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the line, he had taken a wrong turn. And no matter how hard he worked or how tightly he clung to this life he'd built, the cracks were showing. It was a Saturday afternoon when Anthony saw them. He was running errands downtown, picking up Sarah's dry cleaning and grabbing a few things from the market, when he spotted them across the street. Julia. And the kids. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen her in years, not since the divorce. And the kids. God, they were bigger now. He could see them clearly from where he stood, their faces filled with laughter as they walked beside her. There was a lightness in their step, an ease that tugged at something deep inside him. Julia hadn't changed much. Her hair was longer, maybe, but she still moved with the same quiet grace, the same air of calm that had once soothed him. She was speaking to one of the boys, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The boy, Anthony thought it might be Marcus, looked up at her, his face full of admiration. Anthony's chest tightened. His instinct was to turn away, to walk in the other direction before she saw him, but he couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the sidewalk, his eyes locked on the scene in front of him. There they were, his children. The triplets he had abandoned. The children he had refused to claim. Regret hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't expected. He'd buried these feelings for so long, pushed them deep down where he didn't have to face them. But seeing them now, living their lives without him, happy and whole, it gutted him. Julia looked up, her eyes scanning the street, and for a brief second, they met his. Anthony's heart stuttered in his chest. Her expression changed, but only slightly, a flicker of recognition, quickly replaced by something unreadable. She didn't stop walking, didn't call out to him. She simply turned away, guiding the children across the street, her back to him once more. It took everything in Anthony not to follow her, not to chase after her and beg for forgiveness. But what could he say? What could he possibly offer them now? The rest of the afternoon was a blur. He finished his errands, though he could barely focus on the tasks at hand. Julia's face, the faces of his children, were burned into his mind. How had they moved on so easily? How had Julia raised them without him, built a life that seemed content? The guilt that had gnawed at him for years now flared into something sharper. He had told himself that walking away had been the right thing. He'd convinced himself that Julia had betrayed him, that the children weren't his. But deep down, there had always been doubt, lingering just below the surface. And now that doubt was consuming him. When Anthony returned home, Sarah was sitting at the dining room table, flipping through home design catalogs. She barely looked up when he walked in. "Did you get the dry cleaning?" she asked, her voice distant. "Yeah," Anthony muttered, setting the bags down on the counter. Sarah glanced at him then, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You look off. Something happen?" Anthony hesitated, his thoughts still tangled with the image of Julia and the children. "No, it's nothing. Just a long day." Sarah studied him for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. But she didn't push. She never did. Instead, she went back to her magazines, her focus shifting effortlessly away from him. As Anthony stood there, watching her, he realized how distant he had become from his own life. Everything felt wrong, his marriage, his job, the choices that had led him here. He had built a world that looked perfect on the outside, but inside, it was crumbling. And for the first time, he wondered if it was too late to fix any of it. Julia was folding laundry when the knock came. It was mid-afternoon, the triplets were at school, and the apartment was quiet save for the soft hum of the washing machine. She wasn't expecting anyone, and most of the people in her life, what few remained, usually called before they stopped by. The persistent knock echoed through the small space again, a little louder this time. She hesitated for a moment, wiping her hands on her jeans, and made her way to the door. When she opened it, she froze. Standing there, as though plucked from a memory, was Anthony's mother, Evelyn. Julia hadn't seen her since the divorce. The last time they'd spoken, Evelyn's face had been full of pity and disappointment, the same as everyone else's. Julia had always liked Evelyn. The older woman had treated her with warmth during her marriage to Anthony, a quiet but strong presence at family gatherings. But after the split, she had disappeared from Julia's life like everyone else, aligning herself with her son. "Evelyn," Julia managed, still in shock. "What are you doing here?" Evelyn's face was lined with weariness, her gray hair swept back neatly, but her eyes held a familiar resolve. "I need to talk to you, Julia," she said softly, her voice carrying both urgency and hesitation. "May I come in?" Julia stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She wanted to tell her to leave, to turn her away like Anthony had turned his back on her. But something in Evelyn's expression made her step aside and gesture her in. The two women sat at the small kitchen table, an awkward silence hanging between them. Julia fidgeted with a dish towel in her lap, unsure where this conversation was headed. Evelyn took a deep breath, folding her hands in front of her, and began. "I know you don't owe me anything," she started, her voice steady but edged with something close to regret. "But there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Julia frowned, confusion spreading across her features. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn looked down at her hands, gathering her thoughts before meeting Julia's eyes again. "It's about the children," she said carefully. "About Anthony's side of the family." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Julia felt her heart quicken, that old wound of doubt tearing open just a little. "Evelyn, what is this?" "Anthony's great-grandfather was African American," Evelyn revealed, her voice firm but gentle. "He married a white woman during a time when that wasn't easily accepted, and they kept it quiet. Only the family knew. Over time, people just forgot. It wasn't spoken about, and it never came up with Anthony. But it's there, in the bloodline. Your children, they take after him." Julia sat back, stunned. The room seemed to shift, the words sinking in slowly as she tried to piece it all together. It explained so much. The color of her children's skin, Anthony's disbelief, the accusations that had torn their family apart. For years, she had been burdened by the mystery, plagued by Anthony's accusations of betrayal, but here was the answer. And it had been there all along. "I didn't know how to tell you," Evelyn continued, her voice thick with guilt. "I didn't think it would matter, but then Anthony, he reacted the way he did, and I should have said something sooner. I'm so sorry, Julia." Julia's chest tightened, her thoughts racing. She had lived for years under the weight of a false accusation, her life torn apart by something beyond her control. And now, the truth sat before her, delivered in the same quiet voice that had once welcomed her into the family. "You could have saved us," Julia whispered, her voice barely audible, the pain evident in her words. "You could have told him." Evelyn winced, the regret clear in her eyes. "I know," she said softly. "I was wrong. I was trying to protect the family, but in the end, I hurt you. I hurt all of you." Julia stood, unable to sit still any longer, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. She moved to the window, staring out at the street below, trying to gather her thoughts. The triplets had been asking more questions lately about their father, about why he wasn't in their lives. And now, Julia had answers she wasn't sure she wanted. "What do I do with this?" Julia asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Do I tell him? Do I tell the kids?" Evelyn rose from the table, moving to stand beside her. "That's up to you," she said gently. "But Anthony, he should know. He's living with a lie, just like you have been." Julia felt a surge of anger. The idea of confronting Anthony, of dredging up the past after everything she'd been through, made her stomach churn. She had built a life for herself and her children, imperfect, yes, but it was hers. Did she really want to risk that by opening old wounds? Evelyn placed a hand on her arm, a small gesture of comfort. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said quietly. "But I hope you can find some peace now that you know the truth." Julia didn't respond, her mind too clouded by everything she had just learned. Evelyn gave her a small, sad smile and turned to leave. Meanwhile, miles away, Sarah was piecing together her own version of the truth. She had always known about Anthony's past, had heard bits and pieces about his previous marriage. But she had never really cared, until now. There had been whispers, comments from friends, about how Anthony had children from a previous marriage. But he never spoke about them, and Sarah had chosen to ignore it, convinced it didn't matter. But something had changed in Anthony recently. He was more distant, more withdrawn, and Sarah had begun to suspect that there was more to his past than he was letting on. She had gone digging, as she always did when something didn't sit right with her. And now, she had found what she was looking for. A photograph. Julia, with 3 children, Anthony's children. And there, in the faces of those children, Sarah saw something that terrified her. They were a part of him, a part he had kept hidden. They were proof that his life, his heart, wasn't wholly hers. Sarah's grip on the photograph tightened. She wasn't going to let this woman, this past life, destroy everything she had worked for. Anthony was hers now, and she would do whatever it took to keep it that way. As Sarah stared at the photo, a dangerous resolve settled in her chest. She had no intention of letting Julia or those children back into Anthony's life. Not now. Not ever. Julia stood outside Anthony's house, staring at the elegant white door with its polished brass knocker. It looked so different from the life they'd once shared, their modest house, their simple beginnings. She could hear the muffled sounds of the neighborhood around her, children playing down the street, the hum of cars passing by. But inside, Julia's heart raced. She hadn't planned to be here. She hadn't thought she'd ever be back in Anthony's world. But after Evelyn's visit, she couldn't escape the truth any longer. Her hand hovered over the knocker, her mind spinning with everything she wanted to say. How could she condense years of pain, betrayal, and now, the revelation that could have saved them? Her chest tightened as she imagined his reaction. Would he even care? Would he be relieved? Julia didn't know, but the question swirling in her children's eyes lately had pushed her to this doorstep. As she raised her hand to knock, the door flew open. Startled, Julia found herself face to face with Sarah. Anthony's wife was as polished as ever, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her face a cool mask of control. But behind those eyes, something flickered, something dark and restless. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice as sharp as a blade. Julia hadn't expected this confrontation, not yet, at least. She had come to talk to Anthony, to tell him the truth about his children. The last thing she wanted was a scene in front of Sarah. But now, standing here, she realized she had no choice. "I need to talk to Anthony," Julia said firmly, meeting Sarah's cold stare. Sarah's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said, stepping forward to block the doorway. "He's moved on, Julia. You should too." "I'm not here to reopen old wounds, Sarah," Julia said, forcing her voice to stay calm. This is about the truth, about the children. He needs to know. Sarah's eyes flashed with something close to panic, and for a split second, Julia saw it, the cracks beneath her perfect exterior. Anthony doesn't need to know anything about those children, Sarah spat, her voice rising. They're not his problem. You're not his problem anymore. Julia stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. They're his children, Sarah. He deserves to know the truth. At that, Sarah's mask cracked. Her face twisted with rage as she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low hiss. No, she whispered. He doesn't. And neither do you. Julia's heart pounded as she realized the depth of Sarah's desperation. There was something unhinged in her eyes, something that made Julia's stomach turn. You can't keep this from him forever, Julia said, her voice quiet but steady. Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing Julia's arm. I've worked too hard to build this life, she snapped, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. You don't get to waltz in here and ruin everything because you can't let go of the past. Julia pulled her arm free, stepping back in shock. This isn't about me, she said, her voice rising. It's about Anthony and his children. You can't control the truth, Sarah. At that moment, the door behind Sarah opened wider, and Anthony appeared. His face was pale, his expression tense as he took in the scene unfolding in front of him. What's going on here? He asked, his voice wary. For a moment, none of them spoke. Sarah's chest heaved with anger, her eyes darting between Julia and Anthony. Julia could see the panic rising in her, the realization that everything she had worked to control was slipping away. Finally, Julia spoke, her voice calm but unwavering. Anthony, I came to tell you the truth about our children. Anthony's face froze. He glanced at Sarah, then back at Julia, confusion and fear clouding his features. What truth? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julia took a deep breath, steadying herself. Your great-grandfather was African American, she said, watching the shock ripple across his face. That's why the children look the way they do. It's in your family, Anthony. They're your children. They've always been your children. The color drained from Anthony's face. He staggered back, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. What? He whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know, Julia continued, her voice soft but firm. Evelyn told me. She didn't think it would matter, and by the time it did, it was too late. Sarah's face twisted into a mask of fury, but Anthony's eyes were locked on Julia, his mind racing to process what she had just told him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of his actions, the years of bitterness and denial, crashed over him all at once. I'm sorry, Anthony finally whispered, his voice raw. Julia, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't. You didn't believe me, Julia said, her voice sharp with pain. You threw us away. Anthony's eyes filled with tears, but before he could respond, a loud crash came from the hallway. The triplets stood there, their wide eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Lily had dropped her school bag on the floor, her face pale with confusion. Mom? Marcus asked, his voice trembling. What's going on? Julia's heart sank. She had hoped to have this conversation without them overhearing, but now there was no turning back. She knelt down, her eyes level with her children. Come here, she said softly, her voice filled with a mother's love and sorrow. The three children moved closer, their faces filled with questions they were too young to fully understand. Julia took a deep breath, her heart breaking as she prepared to tell them the truth. This is your father, she said, her voice trembling but clear. The triplets stared at Anthony, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Anthony took a shaky step forward, his eyes full of regret. I'm your dad, he said, his voice barely holding together. Caleb, the quietest of the three, was the first to speak. "Why didn't you want us?" Anthony recoiled as if he had been struck. Tears filled his eyes as he struggled to find the right words. "I didn't know," he choked out. "I didn't understand. But I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The triplets stood frozen, processing this man who had been a shadow in their lives for so long. Julia's heart ached as she watched the pain and confusion in their eyes. The truth had come out, but the scars would remain. As Anthony fell to his knees in front of his children, Sarah's furious voice sliced through the air. "You think you can just walk back into their lives?" she snarled, her face contorted with rage. "You don't get to do that. You don't deserve them." But Julia had stopped listening. She pulled her children close, holding them as they trembled in her arms. No matter what happened next, she knew one thing: she would protect them. Even if it meant keeping their father at a distance forever. The tension that had simmered between Julia, Anthony, and Sarah finally boiled over in the weeks that followed the confrontation. Anthony tried to reach out to Julia, desperate to rebuild the bridges he had burned, but she kept him at arm's length, unsure if she could ever fully trust him again. For the triplets, the newfound knowledge of their father's existence brought a mix of confusion and hope, but Julia knew they weren't ready for a relationship with him, not yet. Meanwhile, Sarah's calm exterior was beginning to crack. She had always thrived on control, on the careful management of her world, but the truth of Anthony's past, those children, Julia's reappearance, was a threat she hadn't anticipated. Day by day, she felt that control slipping away, and she clung to Anthony tighter than ever. It started with small things: Sarah snapping at Anthony over minor issues, her obsessive need to know where he was at all times. She combed through his emails, monitored his phone, constantly searching for signs of betrayal. The cracks grew wider with every confrontation. She refused to let go of her version of their life, and in doing so, her paranoia took over. One night, Anthony returned home late from work, tired and worn down. Sarah was waiting in the living room, her eyes dark and glittering with suspicion. She didn't even let him take off his coat before the accusations began. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "With her again?" Anthony sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was at work, Sarah. I've told you 100 times, I'm not seeing Julia. I'm trying to fix things, but it's for the kids, not us." "Fix things?" Sarah scoffed, her voice rising. "What's there to fix? Those children aren't part of your life, they never were. I won't let them ruin everything we've built." "Everything we've built?" Anthony echoed, his patience finally wearing thin. "Sarah, this life we've built is suffocating me. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending like the past doesn't exist. Those kids are mine, and I won't abandon them again." Sarah's face twisted with fury. "You think you can just walk away from me? From us?" Her voice shook, and for the first time, Anthony saw how far gone she was. There was no reasoning with her now. Her need to control, to possess, had pushed her beyond the brink. The next morning, Julia woke to the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. Groggy, she reached for it, surprised to see a missed call from Anthony. But before she could process why he would call her so early, there was another knock at the door. A loud, insistent banging that made her heart leap into her throat. She grabbed her robe and hurried to the door, a strange sense of foreboding creeping up her spine. When she opened it, Anthony stood there, his face pale and drawn. "She's lost it, Julia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do." "What do you mean?" Julia asked, alarm rising in her chest. "She's been unraveling for weeks," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "But last night, she packed a bag. Said she was leaving, but only if I came with her. I told her I couldn't just walk away from the kids, and he stopped, his voice cracking. "What did she do?" Julia asked, fear twisting inside her. "She threatened to hurt herself." Or me. I think she means it, Julia. I need help. Julia stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She knew Sarah was obsessive, but this? You need to call someone, Julia said, trying to keep her voice steady. This isn't something we can fix. I thought maybe you could talk to her, Anthony said, desperation flickering in his eyes. She listens to you. She thinks you're the enemy, but maybe if you... No, Anthony. Julia shook her head firmly. This is more than I can handle. You need to get her some real help before she does something that can't be undone. Later that evening, when Julia thought the storm might have passed, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Anthony. It was the police. Sarah had driven off, erratically swerving through traffic, refusing to stop until she reached Julia's apartment. By the time Julia stepped outside, Sarah was already standing by her car, shaking and wild-eyed, her voice slurring with desperation as she shouted for Anthony. Come out, Anthony. You think you can hide from me? You think you can just pick her over me? Her words were jumbled, angry, her control slipping completely. It wasn't long before she was restrained, but the damage was already done. The carefully built facade Sarah had held on to for so long was shattered. And with it, any hope of salvaging their life together. The sirens pierced the quiet night as police cars pulled up, their lights flashing against the dark street. Sarah stood in the middle of the road, wild-eyed and furious, her voice hoarse from shouting. Anthony was there, too, trying to calm her, his own face a mask of helplessness. But it was clear that Sarah had crossed a line, one she couldn't return from. Julia watched from a distance, arms wrapped around herself, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The children were asleep in the apartment, but their innocence was at risk of being shattered by the chaos Sarah had created. This was supposed to be the end of their nightmare, and yet here it was, spiraling further into darkness. Sarah had always been in control, or at least, she had always appeared that way. Her immaculate life, her obsession with perfection, had hidden the instability underneath. But now it was all coming out. Julia could see the cracks widening as Sarah screamed at the police, resisting their attempts to restrain her. Her once composed, manipulative self was gone, replaced by a woman unhinged, broken by her own need to hold on to something that had never truly been hers. It didn't take long for the officers to lead Sarah to a waiting ambulance. Her cries quieted, turning into sobs that echoed in the night. The neighbors who had peeked out from their windows slowly retreated, leaving the scene in an eerie stillness. As the ambulance pulled away, Anthony stood alone in the street. His shoulders slumped, and he seemed smaller than Julia had ever seen him. She had no sympathy for him at that moment, though. He had made choices, and those choices had led them all here. Sarah's breakdown was only part of the damage left behind. In the days that followed, Julia focused on her children. Their lives needed stability now more than ever, and with Sarah out of the picture, Julia could finally begin to build a safe space for them. Or so she thought. Because a few days later, Julia received another letter, the same cryptic handwriting as the one from years ago. Inside was a photograph. It was old, yellowed with time, but unmistakable. The man in the photograph was Anthony's great-grandfather, standing next to another man. The second man, however, was the real surprise, a man who looked exactly like Caleb, one of their triplets. There was a note scribbled beneath it. Not all secrets stay buried. Julia's heart raced as she read the words, the weight of the photograph sinking in. It wasn't just Anthony's ancestry that had shaped her children's appearance. There was another twist, another layer to the mystery she thought had been solved. This man in the photograph was not just a distant relative. He was a long-lost twin of Anthony's great-grandfather, a hidden branch of the family tree that had been forgotten. But their striking resemblance to Caleb was undeniable. The cryptic letters, the strange clues about Anthony's family, they weighed on her mind like stones. There was something there, something she hadn't fully uncovered. she needed answers, if only to make sense of the twisted road that had brought her here. Years ago, when the first letter arrived, she had been in no position to investigate family secrets, but now, her curiosity was too big. Julia reached out to Dr. Anna Hartley, an ancestry specialist recommended by a friend. Dr. Hartley had a reputation for finding hidden family histories, the kind of secrets people kept buried for generations. Julia wasn't sure what she was hoping to find, but she knew there was more to Anthony's past than he had let on. When Dr. Hartley arrived at her apartment, she was a quiet, unassuming woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened as Julia explained the situation, detailing the letters she had received, the family secrets Anthony had never spoken about, and the mysterious hints of an inheritance that had been hinted at but never revealed. Dr. Hartley took it all in, her fingers brushing over the old letters Julia handed her. "It sounds like there's more to this than just a forgotten family branch," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I'll start with public records and work from there. If there's something worth finding, I'll find it." It didn't take long for Dr. Hartley to return with her first findings. Sitting across from Julia in the small, cluttered kitchen, she spread out documents and old records she had retrieved. "There's an estate," Dr. Hartley said, her tone careful. "It was passed down through Anthony's great-grandfather's line, but because of racial tensions and internal family disputes, it was hidden away. The family was divided after his great-grandfather's marriage to a woman from a different background, something that wasn't accepted at the time. That division kept the inheritance from being claimed." Julia stared at the papers, her heart pounding. The estate, now unclaimed for years, was significant, both financially and historically. It had been kept from Anthony's immediate family due to old prejudices and family conflict, lost in the tangle of generational secrets. "This estate belongs to your children," Dr. Hartley continued, pushing the papers toward her. "Legally, they're the rightful heirs." Julia sat back, her mind reeling. Her children were the legal heirs to a vast piece of land, a part of Anthony's family legacy that had been hidden for so long. It felt surreal, almost too much to take in. But there it was, the truth in black and white. Still, a nagging question remained. Why hadn't Anthony told her any of this? If he had known about the estate, why had he stayed silent? The more Julia delved into the details, the more the uneasy feeling grew in the pit of her stomach. Anthony had reappeared in her life months ago, claiming regret, asking for forgiveness, and trying to reconnect with their children. But now, she wondered, had he known about this all along? Was his return driven by a genuine desire to make amends, or was it motivated by something far more selfish? She thought back to every conversation they'd had since he came back. At first, she wanted to believe that his sorrow was real. That the years of distance had weighed on him and made him realize the mistake he'd made. But now, in the cold light of these new revelations, his remorse seemed less heartfelt and more strategic. Later that afternoon, Julia called Anthony and asked him to come over. She needed to confront him with what she had learned, and she needed to hear the truth from him directly. When he arrived, there was an air of uncertainty between them. He sat across from her at the same kitchen table where she had spent hours sifting through the tangled web of his family's history. "I found out about the estate," Julia began, her voice calm but firm. "The one tied to your great-grandfather. The land. The inheritance." Anthony's face tightened, but he said nothing, his hands resting on the table in front of him, fingers laced together as if bracing himself for what was to come. "How long have you known?" Julia asked, her eyes locked on him. Anthony took a breath. "I didn't." "Don't lie to me, Anthony," Julia interrupted, her voice sharp. "You knew. You knew about it before you came back into our lives." There was a long silence. Julia could see the guilt written across his face, the way his eyes flickered with regret and shame. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with the weight of his mistakes. "I found out a few months before I came back," Anthony admitted. "But I didn't come back just for the inheritance, Julia. I swear. I came back because I knew I had to fix things. I had to make it right with you and the kids. Julia felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat, but she swallowed it back. And you didn't think that the inheritance, this huge part of your family's history, was something you should have told me from the beginning? You didn't think I deserved to know that? Anthony looked down at his hands. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want you to think I was just coming back for that. But you were, Julia said softly, her heart breaking a little more with every word. You knew the truth, and you kept it from me. You kept it from us. Anthony raised his eyes, meeting hers, and she saw the pain there, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. I didn't want to lose you all again, he said. I thought if I could make things right, then the inheritance would just be part of it. Something for the kids. Something to help them. Julia leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. Do you even hear yourself? You kept something this big from your own children, and now you expect me to just, what? Forgive you? Anthony's silence was all the answer she needed. She knew then that she couldn't trust him, not fully. Maybe part of him did want to be a father again, but there was no denying that his return had been tainted by greed, by the knowledge of the estate and what it could offer. The next day, Julia decided to visit Evelyn. The two women hadn't spoken much since Anthony had come back into the picture, and Julia wasn't sure how this conversation would go. But there was only one way to find out. When Evelyn opened the door, she looked surprised to see Julia standing there. Julia, I didn't expect. I need to talk to you, Julia cut in gently but firmly. Evelyn stepped aside, allowing her into the house. The living room was the same as it had always been, immaculate, almost too perfect. Julia remembered spending quiet afternoons here during her marriage to Anthony, feeling like an outsider, despite Evelyn's polite kindness. But this time, she wasn't here for pleasantries. They sat across from each other, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Evelyn's face was unreadable, but Julia noticed the way her hands fidgeted slightly in her lap. I know it was you, Julia said, holding up one of the letters. You sent these. For a moment, Evelyn said nothing, her eyes flicking to the paper in Julia's hand. Then she let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping. I did, she admitted quietly. Julia stared at her, anger and confusion mixing in her chest. Why? Why not just tell me the truth? I thought about it, Evelyn replied, her voice soft but steady. But I didn't know how. I didn't know if you'd believe me, or if it would push you further away. You were always strong, Julia, but I could see how hurt you were after the divorce. I didn't want to make things harder. Harder? Julia's voice rose slightly. Evelyn, you hid an entire part of your family's history from me. My children are the rightful heirs to this estate, and instead of telling me, you sent anonymous letters? What did you think was going to happen? Evelyn's gaze dropped to the floor. I knew Anthony wouldn't tell you. He's always been proud, always convinced that he can control everything. And I didn't want my grandchildren to miss out on what's rightfully theirs, because of his mistakes. Julia shook her head, trying to process the weight of Evelyn's words. She wanted to be furious, but there was a sincerity in Evelyn's eyes that gave her pause. So you've known about the estate all along? Yes, Evelyn admitted. It's been kept quiet because of what happened to Anthony's great-grandfather. He married a black woman in a time when it wasn't accepted, and the family split over it. They left that part of our history in the shadows, and when the estate went unclaimed, it was almost forgotten. But when the triplets were born, I realized they had a right to know. They're part of this legacy. Julia sat back, letting the truth settle in. It was overwhelming, to say the least. The estate was a huge part of their children's future, something that could change their lives forever. And yet, Anthony had kept it from them. Even now, after his apologies and his supposed desire to reconnect, he had never once mentioned it. I knew Anthony found out about the estate months ago, Evelyn continued, her voice filled with quiet regret. That's when I started sending the letters. I wanted you to discover the truth, before he could twist it to his advantage. Julia's heart sank. She had hoped, even after all the hurt, that Anthony's regret had been real, that his desire to be a father again came from a place of love, not greed. But now it seemed everything had been tainted by this secret. He knew? Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded. Yes. He knew. But I believe that deep down, he does want to make things right. He's just lost, Julia. He's always been lost. Julia stood, her emotions swirling. She couldn't fully forgive Evelyn for keeping the secret, but she understood why she had done it. And in a way, Evelyn's actions had led her to the truth, even if it had come in the most convoluted way possible. I need to protect my children, Julia said, her voice stronger now. I can't let Anthony keep making these decisions for them. I know, Evelyn replied. But please, let me be a part of their lives. They're my grandchildren, and I love them. I want to help, however I can. Julia didn't respond right away. She wasn't ready to make any promises. Julia stood in the living room, her hands clenched at her sides. Anthony sat on the couch across from her, his head bowed, as if he already knew what was coming. The house felt too small for the weight of the conversation they were about to have, too suffocating with the years of betrayal and secrets finally bubbling to the surface. I can't do this anymore, Julia said, her voice steady but cold. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but the words still stung on her lips. I can't keep pretending that things will ever be the same between us. Anthony lifted his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and desperation. Julia, I'm sorry. I know I've made mistakes. But I want to be here for the kids, I want to fix things. Julia shook her head. It's not about that anymore. You hid the truth from me. From them. Even now, after all your apologies, I can't trust that you came back for the right reasons. Maybe part of you cares about being a father again, but I can't ignore the fact that you knew about the estate, and you kept it from us. Anthony opened his mouth to protest, but Julia held up a hand. This isn't about us anymore, Anthony. It's about the kids. And I won't let them be part of your games, whatever your reasons were. Our relationship is over. It's been over for a long time. You'll always be their father, but you don't have a place in their lives anymore. Her words hit like a final blow. Anthony sat in silence, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Julia turned away, unable to bear the sight of him any longer. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. The betrayal ran too deep, and she wasn't willing to let him hurt their children the way he had hurt her. The decision to move to the estate had come with a strange sense of relief. The estate, with its sprawling fields and historic house, offered not just financial security, but a new beginning, one far removed from the tangled mess of her past with Anthony. It was more than just land, it was a place where her children could grow up free from the shadows that had haunted them. Standing on the porch of their new home, Julia felt the cool breeze on her face and closed her eyes, breathing in the fresh air. The property stretched out before them, vast and beautiful, untouched by time and rich with history. For the first time in years, she felt like she was in control of her own life. The past had been riddled with pain, but the future was hers to shape. The triplets were already exploring the grounds, their laughter echoing through the trees as they ran and played. Julia smiled softly, watching them, knowing that this was the kind of life they deserved. A life of opportunity, of space to breathe and grow. Here, in this place, they could be free of the weight of their father's mistakes. Evelyn arrived later that afternoon, as she had promised she would. Since the truth had come out, she had made a concerted effort to be a part of the children's lives, something that Julia, despite everything, appreciated. The kids deserved a grandmother who loved them, and Evelyn, for all her past mistakes, had proven herself to be genuine in her desire to make amends. "Thank you for letting me be part of their lives," Evelyn said, her voice soft as she stood beside Julia on the porch, watching the children play in the distance. "I know I haven't always made the right choices, but I want to do better by them." Julia nodded, her gaze still on the triplets. "They need you. They deserve to know where they come from, to have some connection to their family. And as long as you're here for them, for the right reasons, you'll always have a place in their lives." Evelyn smiled, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "You're a good mother, Julia. They're lucky to have you." Julia didn't respond, but her heart warmed at the words. She had fought so hard to protect her children, to give them the life they deserved, and now, for the first time, it felt like she had succeeded. As the weeks passed, the estate became their haven. The triplets thrived in their new environment, their days filled with exploration and adventure, their nights filled with stories of their great-grandfather's legacy. Julia often found herself wandering the grounds, marveling at how much history was tied to this place, to her children's heritage. It wasn't just about the land or the financial security, it was about giving her children a future that was rooted in something real, something theirs. Anthony had reached out a few times after their last conversation, but Julia never responded. She had made her decision, and there was no going back. The wounds he had left were too deep, and while she would always allow her children to know their father's name, she knew that his role in their lives was over. The triplets, still young, asked about their father from time to time. Julia answered their questions honestly but carefully. She didn't want to fill their hearts with anger or resentment. She simply told them the truth: their father had made mistakes, and while he loved them in his own way, they were better off without the confusion he had brought into their lives. With Evelyn now a regular presence, the children began to form a bond with their grandmother. She became a steady figure in their lives, someone they could turn to for stories about their family's past, about the estate they now called home. For Evelyn, it was a chance at redemption, a way to finally be the grandmother she had always wanted to be but had never known how. Julia stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The children were inside, laughing and playing, their voices drifting through the open windows. Evelyn had just left after a long afternoon of baking with the kids, and the house smelled of fresh cookies. For the first time in years, Julia felt at peace. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had carved out a new life for herself and her children, one free from the pain and betrayal of her marriage to Anthony. And while their journey had been difficult, she knew they were on the right path. The future was theirs now,